Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. Last week I showed you how to add ASPnet Core Identity to an existing Blazor server app for authentication and authorization. This week I've invited back my friend Chris Sainty to help me add identity to an existing Blazor WebAssembly application. You know, Chris wrote a blog post back in July 2019 showing how to do this with JSON web tokens. Since then, a few things have changed, but the technique is still quite valid. So today, we're going to give your WASM apps identity. And that's coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. I'd like to welcome back to Blazor Train Mr. Chris Sainty. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Carl.
So I learned this technique from you and a blog post that you did. And I think I even have the blog post up here. Yeah, here it is.
Yeah, that's a popular one, I have to say, considering it's getting a little old now, but still relevant. And I think it's still probably one of the most viewed ones on my blog, I think.
Yeah, so it's easy if you're starting fresh with a new application. But, you know, we've been writing Blazor apps now for a while. And, oh, yeah, we need identity and authentication and authorization. How do we do that? There wasn't a lot of guidance for that. But I did find some documentation, and that's this guy right here, Scaffold Identity and ASPnet Core Projects. And it does sort of get you some part of the way there to a Blazor server application, but not really a WebAssembly application. Basically, they tell you that the scaffolding doesn't work in a Blazor WebAssembly application. So I relied on your blog post and updated some of the code to be, updated the packages and that kind of stuff. But the technique is essentially the same. So we're going to go through this process with a new hosted WebAssembly application. Last week it was add identity. It was a Blazor server application. This week it's add identity WASM. So I'm going to start with all the packages. So we're going to get rid of that. And yes, there are quite a few packages here. This is everything that I'm going to be using. So you've got stuff like the jot bearer.
Yeah, definitely. So that's an important one. So we're going to use some of the stuff in there to generate a JSON web token, and that's going to take care of like signing and all of that kind of stuff. And we can also use that to tell the API to use JSON web tokens for authentication as well.
Right. And then you have the standard stuff to create the databases and the identity database and use the Entity Framework stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's just a load of base packages there for, the identity system. Like you said, some Entity Framework stuff.
All right. So next we're going to go into our app settings JSON. So we're going to add the connection string here. And the database will be called add identity WASM. Just like last week where we created a database called add identity, this one will be add identity WASM. So we need that first. I don't have the database created right there, so you don't see it. All right, so let's look at our data context. We'll create that. I'm going to create a folder called data over in the server project. And we'll add application DB context there. And it's complaining because I haven't actually saved my CSproj file with all the packages. So there we go. And nothing really special here. It's just a DB context that inherits identity DB context. It's kind of cool that we have stuff built in that uses Entity Framework for the specific purpose of doing identity, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's a big help. I mean, what's nice about inheriting from Identity DB context is that's going to go and create all of those base tables that the identity system uses for things like storing roles and the actual users table and all that kind of stuff. And we don't actually have to care about it. we can just inherit from that base context and off we go.
Yep. Very nice. All right, so we'll add a few services to start up here. So this is going to need to be qualified, this namespace here, and SQL Server, and identity. So far, so good.
So far, so good. So just to cover that, basically the first bit that we've added in there, the add DB context, is just registering that new application DB context with the services container, and we're referencing the connection string that we created earlier in the app settings JSON file. And then the second line is basically registering all of the identity services and telling identity that we want to use entity framework as the backing store and to use the application DB context that we provided to access that store.
Excellent. Okay, next, now I've added some comments right here. We're going to add a migration. It doesn't really matter what we call it, but that's going to go in the data migrations folder. I'll copy that into the clipboard and open the package manager console. Now this is a hosted WASM application, so you got to make sure that we're adding this to the right project. It's the server project, not the client or the shared. And away we go. And there it is in all its glory. Now we just need to do an update -database. Done. And now we should have our add identity WASM database right there. Now we need to add the authentication service right there. And this is going to use the JOT bearer defaults. We're pulling these from configuration, but we don't have those in our config file yet, so let's add them. All right, and probably a good idea to explain this.
Yeah, definitely.
So I've created this GUID and just stuck it in there. It just has to be unique in the world, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, probably it's worth having a really big, long security key that's just a random kind of string that you generate. I think in the blog post I went with a GUID here because it was just a simple way of illustrating that it was a random chunk of data.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure on this, but I've been told, or I've read that potentially having a key that's over 256 bytes is kind of the most ideal from a security perspective. But this will certainly get the job done.
Okay. And the JOT issuer and audience, also important. Yeah. Now, this is localhost while we're developing and will be whatever the domain is after we're done, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. So what's going to happen here is this is going to get sort of added to the JOT tokens payload to say like who is a valid issuer, who is a valid audience to use this token. And then when we go back over to the startup file in a second, we'll see that we're going to validate against that to make sure that the token has been issued by the right person and it's being sent by the right audience.
And this expiry in days means that we, if we come back within 24 hours, we don't have to log in again.
Exactly right. So the token we generate is going to be valid for 24 hours. After that, even though it's still valid in terms of its signature and all this kind of thing, it won't be valid because the length of its expiry.
Okay. So let's go back to startup, and that is the configure services. Now we'll go down to the configure method, and we'll add a couple of things after use routing. Use authentication and use authorization. Seems pretty cut and dry to me.
Yeah, that's just setting up the middleware pipeline. And as long as those things, with the middleware pipeline, it's always important. Order is always an important thing. So it's just important we have those after the routing, but before the endpoints middleware.
Yeah. All right, now we can add a controller or two. Well, let's start with the accounts controller. It's pretty simple. There's just a post, but we've got some models that we have to create. And it might seem strange to somebody watching this that, isn't there like standard ways to do these things? Aren't these classes already built? Well, no, because identity is something that's fluid. It's something that you have a lot of control over, isn't it?
Exactly right. Yeah. And you can customize it however you want.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to add these to the shared project. We could create a models folder, but I won't for brevity. Register model will be the first one. Now, here's where we can use the data annotations to put some rules in here. The email is essentially our main identifier, and it's required. It is an email address, so when we're entering that into a form, if there's no @ sign, for example, if there's 2 @ signs, we'll get some validation errors on it. And same with the password. It's a data type password. We have a maximum string length of 100, and it is also required. Confirm password. I love this. Compare to password. This is just an attribute, and it'll tell you if the password and confirmation passwords don't match. You don't actually have to write that code.
That's a really nice one. That and email address are 2 of my favorites, I think.
Okay, next is register result. We'll add that one as well. That's what the API method endpoint sends back. Pretty simple. Success or failure, and a string of errors. And there may be more than one error if you have, for example, inner exceptions that you want to pull information from, that kind of thing. Just ultimately flexible. Okay, let's add a login controller. Pretty simple, but again, we have some models that we're going to do. Actually, you know what? Let's go back to accounts controller. I want to go back to the accounts controller now that we have our models, so we can talk through this post the register model and the register result.
Yeah, exactly right. So what we're going to do is, and we'll see the kind of the other side of this in a bit when we move over to the Blazor app, but the register model is going to be used on the Blazor side to collect the information from the user. So they're going to be able to input their email address and their password, and then that can get sent up to the API from Blazor.
Mm-hmm.
So we're then going to post this endpoint. We can then use the data in the register model to create a new identity user, which is what's happening there on line 25. Once we've got a new identity user, we can then use the user manager, which is a class that's provided by the identity system again, and it's got this method, create async, and we can pass in our identity user, and then we pass in the password that the user requires, and that's going to do all of the work of going off and storing all the various bits of information about that user in the various tables that the identity system needs. So they were all created when we scaffolded out the DB earlier. So we should see a few different tables in here.
Right. I want to look at the columns in ASPnet Users. There's some good stuff in here. And I'll just zoom in with my video editor here. So the username, the email, the normalized email, which I guess is lowercase, a bit whether the email is confirmed or not. This is something that I kind of glossed over last week. The UI that's scaffolded out for you doesn't really have an email service, right? So if you want to do email confirmation, which I think you should, you're going to have to wire that up using your email credentials and all of that stuff. But in the very least you need to do is set that bit, right? So the email has to be confirmed, and the form that comes up that says confirm your email, you just click it in the back end here. Email confirmed bit is saved. Next is the password hash, and this is important to know because passwords are not stored in this database. They're hashed, and a hash is a one-way encryption algorithm that essentially creates a derivative piece of data or chunk of data, a string, if you will, from another string. And you can't reverse engineer it. You can't get the original string from the hash code, but you can compare the hashes. And so you hash the password that somebody enters in a login form, and then you compare that to the hash that's in the database. So it's not as completely free of liability as it would be if you used a cloud service like Azure AD, B2C, or something like that. But, at least you don't have the ability to read people's passwords, which is good.
Yeah, no one wants to end up on Have I Been Pwned?
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, I just wanted to show a couple of those things right there. Let's move on to our models for the login controller. The first one is a login model, so we'll add that to our shared project. Pretty simple. Email, password, remember me, sticky, and the login result. There you go. Successful, error, and then token. So this will be the JOT token that we on the client side now have to be responsible for storing securely.
Exactly correct. Yeah. So when this comes back, if we've successfully logged in, that will be populated with our JSON web token, and then we're going to store that off into the browser's local storage so we can use it when we make any subsequent calls to the API in the client.
Okay. And the browser local storage is going to be in clear text, or is it not?
Yes. Yeah. It's in clear text. So we can open up the local storage with browser tools, and we can go in there and we could get that token, and we could go and put it in something like jwt.ms, and it could show us what the values are that are inside of it. I have a feeling that scares you.
No, I it is what it is, right? We just want to make sure that everybody knows this.
So it's an important point to understand, because really that is kind of the weakness of JSON Web Tokens in a way, that ultimately if you're in possession of a valid one, then you can access whatever data that token is allowed to access.
Right.
I think the thing that's worth knowing about local storage is that it is scoped to a particular domain. So if we were using this client and it was running from blazortrain.com, only blazortrain.com can access that local storage area. It's kind of sandboxed. So if I tried to come along from nastydomain.com, I wouldn't be able to read those values.
I'm going to register that right now, actually, nastydomain.com. All right, let's jump over to the Blazor application, the client. We're going to add some packages here. And oh, look, our old friend Blazor to local storage. That's you.
That is, yes. Yeah, it does a good job. It does a good job, thankfully.
Yep.
So, yeah, we're going to be using that to kind of work with local storage in a little bit. Seemed to make sense to pop that in there on the blog post. Nothing like a bit of free advertising.
And we get authorization components for ASPnet Core. So, yeah. So that's going to help us gather the stuff we need to on the client side. All right, now let's go to underscore imports Razor and add a couple of using statements here. We need access to our shared project and also ASPnet Core Components Authorization, which we just spoke about. Now comes the big deal. We're adding an Authentication State Provider class. This is something that isn't scaffolded. You have to actually write it yourself.
Yeah, so this is something I think is important as well to point out. This is only something you need to write when you're kind of doing something that's not standard. So, for example, if we were using Azure AD or B2C, or even other providers like Auth0, Blazor's actually got a built-in authentication state provider for those scenarios. So the reason we're having to do this ourselves is because with running identity, we're going to kind of tell it how to decide whether we're authenticated or not. That's essentially what we're going to be doing here.
Okay, and so we're inheriting authentication state provider, which gives us access to the principal, the user, and whether they're authenticated or not, and their roles and all of that stuff.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing here is this get authentication state async method. So when we inherit from authentication state provider, we have to override that method. And essentially what happens here is this method is called by all of the kind of auth aware components that Blazor has. So like the authorized view component is a good example. That requires a authentication state provider to be injected into it, and then it calls this method to understand whether it should show the authorized or the not authorized template, depending on what this method returns. So this is where we're telling the application how to authenticate the user. So to do that, what we're actually doing is we're checking in local storage for an auth token. Now, we haven't quite got as far to the point of saving this auth token yet, but let's pretend that we already have. What we would do here is check local storage and say, is there an auth token present? If there's no auth token in local storage at all, then it's a pretty easy decision. We don't have an authenticated user because we don't have a token. So what we then do is immediately return a new authentication state, but with an empty claims principal and empty claims identity. So that represents a logged out user.
Okay.
If, though, we do have a token coming out of local storage, we do kind of a couple of things. The first thing is we set the authorization header on the HTTP client, and we set it as a bearer token and add the JSON Web Token onto that. Now, that's so that whenever we call the API going forward, that the JSON Web Token is included with that request. Because if we don't include the JSON Web Token with every request, then the API has got no way to authenticate us, and because that token is like our ID, it proves that we are who we are and what our access rights are and things like that. So we set that first, and then the next thing, or the final thing in that, is we return a new authentication state, and that this time, instead of being empty, it's got a claims identity that's based on the claims from the JSON Web Token. And we've got a little helper method there that parses all those claims out from the JSON Web Token and passes them into that claims identity type.
Yeah, this was a something that Steve Sanderson wrote, isn't it? It's just a little, helper tool.
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to make it very clear that I did not write this. This is Steve's work, and thank the Lord, because some of that stuff is a bit past me.
Right, I know the world of tokens. So now we have these two helpers here, mark user as authenticated and mark user as logged out. They seem to be pretty self-descriptive.
Yeah, quite right. So the mark user as authenticated, we're going to use this when a user logs in, and we'll call it after a successful login, and that's going to basically just set up that user and trigger all the authentication stuff on the Blazor side to show them as an authenticated user.
Okay.
The mark user as logged out is obviously going to do the opposite to that. So we're going to call that after we've logged out from the API, and that's going to remove the user or change the user's authenticated state to be basically an anonymous user again, or logged out essentially.
All right. So the next thing we need to do is wrap our router in this guy in app. Okay, so what we've essentially done is wrap the router in cascading authentication state, which we just created that provider. And we've changed the route view here and in the found area to authorized route view.
Yeah, so these are two really important steps, because the cascading authentication state is going to provide that authentication state object to any of sort of the auth components that want to listen to it. And we can write our own components that take it's a cascading parameter of type task authentication state, which we can then await, and then we can use that to get the current user's authentication status.
Awesome.
And then the authorized route view, that's important for when we want to stop a user navigating to a page component that they're not allowed to view. So if we have a page component that has the authorized attribute on it, the authorized root view is aware of that attribute and it understands how to speak to the authentication state provider and check that the user is authorized to view that component before it loads it. Whereas the original component here, which is the root view component, doesn't understand that and it would just navigate there anyway.
Right. All right. So in the client project, I'm going to add a services folder. And to that, we're going to add our auth service. So this is a service that we're going to use on the client to basically register and log in and log out. And we're also going to need an interface for this. So I'm going to press Control-R and Control-I to extract the interface. Because that's essentially how we're going to access it through the interface.
Exactly right. And that's just a good practice because, if we want to test anything later on that's using this service, we can mock out that authentication service, or we could stub it, or whatever we choose to do in testing later. So it's just a nice way to create a seam that we can tear out when we do testing.
So we're passing in an HTTP client, and that will get set up over in program right here. With the base address.
That's right. That's already
so there. Here's the authentication state provider.
Yep. So we're going to ask for one of those and local storage. Exactly. So this is just effectively, this is just creating a nice wrapper around all of the moving parts to our auth implementation so that we can just use this one service in our components and not have to kind of deal with all the underpinnings, if you like.
Very good. Very good.
So starting, I think at the top, we've got the register method is the first one in here.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to use that in our register component, which we'll create in a second. And that, as you can see, takes the register model, which looks familiar. We obviously created that earlier. And all we do with that is we just post it up to the API, that API/accounts endpoint that we had that we created earlier. And then we just wait for a response, and the response will then get deserialized into a register result using those nice new HTTP client extensions.
Mm-hmm. And login is a little bit more involved.
Yes, this one's got a little bit more going on. So in here, again, this is going to get called when we create the login component. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to serialize the login model to JSON. And then we're going to, again, post up to our API. And we're going to go to the login endpoint this time and pass that login object up. And then we're going to wait for the result to come back. When that comes back, we're going to deserialize it into that login result. And then we're basically going to check that it was successful. If that's successful, then we're going to call into our API Authentication State provider. And we're going to call that mark user as authenticated method that we saw earlier. And then the other thing we're going to do here as well is we're going to set that bearer token again, so that we've got the token inside of the HTTP client for any further requests.
And then return the login result. And logout is pretty self-explanatory. Logout's like the easiest thing to do.
Yeah. That's basically just clear all the data, get rid of everything.
Right. Yeah. All right, very good. Let's add our components here. So we're going to add to pages a register page. So it's complaining about IAuth service because we don't have that services namespace yet in imports. Oh, we might as well do that now. Okay, happiness now. We're passing in the auth service by interface. We're injecting also the navigation manager because we're going to have to do some navigating. And we've got a little Boolean show errors right here from the result. And if that is true, we've got a little alert that we're going to show. But this is the main form here. This is an edit form. And we're using our data annotations validator because you remember on the register model, we have all these wonderful rules set up. And really important to do this when people register. So We really need to nail the authenticity of this user. And so, making sure that these passwords match and that they follow the rules is really important right here.
Yeah, I mean, after that, it's pretty much a straightforward edit form, really. We've got the fields available there to collect the various bits of data. And then once we post the form, we go off to the handle registration method down in the code block.
And there it is.
That's it. So just in case we've tried to submit before, we start off by setting show errors to false, just in case we've already got some existing ones. And then we use that auth service and we call the register method that we just saw. And basically, we just await from that, await the result back from that. If it's a successful result, then it's all good, and we navigate the user straight off to the login screen so they can now sign in with their new account. Otherwise, we're going to set those errors and toggle that Boolean, and then we'll get that alert show at the top of the screen with any login issues.
Great. All right, so now let's add a login page. Again, we've got our auth service and a navigation manager, our show errors section. And again, another edit form using the login model.
All pretty similar to the register model, the register component so far. Yeah. And then the only difference this time is we're calling that login method. Yeah.
Okay, now we need a couple of other things to support us here in the shared area. In the client, we're going to add a component called login display. We did this last week too. Pretty simple. Hello @context user identity name. This is a nice little shortcut, right? So if you want to access the user without having the cascading parameter and all of that, it's in @context.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that only is available when you're inside of the authorized view. So that's something that's provided by the authorized view itself. So, and just like other context variables, you can actually rename that as well. So you can always say context equals and give it a different name if you want to make it something more relevant.
Okay, and now we're going to add that to main layout right above the about link. Login display. Standard stuff. Okay, so next we need a logout component, and this goes in the shared, or is this a page?
This is a page, so that will go we can have that alongside the login page as well.
Okay. So pretty simple. We need to call auth service logout and navigate back to home.
Exactly. Yeah, we've got no markup on this page at all. It won't even sort of really register to the user. They'll be sent there, logged out, and back to the home page before they even know what's happened.
All right, so let's give it a go and see what happens here. We at this point should be able to register and log in and log out. Let's just make sure we can do that. Okay, so I'm going to click on register. Here's my email address, carl@franklinsnet. And I'll put in a very, very long and complicated password. And I'm going to make sure they don't match. Press tab. Of course, I'm getting yelled at because they don't match. Now they match. And of course, the email logic works as well if I take out the @ sign. Yep.
Yeah, those validators are so cool.
Yep. All right, so let's register. Takes us right to the login page. And I need to make sure that that @ sign is in there. And I'll log in. And now I am logged in. Hello.
Yay.
And I can... Now we don't have any authorization in place, so let's do that now. I'm going to log out. And let's go to fetch data. Now I've just changed fetch data to wrap it in an authorized view. So that means we have an authorized template where the regular markup goes. That's normally here. And if we're not authorized, it's just going to say, wah, wah. Sorry, you have no business here. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Everything else is the same. So let's give that a go. Now, I had logged out before I quit last time, so that clears the token and all that. If I go to fetch data, okay, now we'll log in and fetch data. Everybody's happy. Here's the other demo that I did last week, which we're now using the cascading parameter task of authentication state task. And our increment count, I've changed that to be an async method. And I'm waiting on authentication state task, looking at the user. If it's authenticated, then I'm incrementing the counter. Otherwise, I have this little display message that says you must log in first. This is the same code from last week that we did in Blazor Server. All right, we are logged in. I can increment the counter. Now I'll log out, go to the counter. So there you go. Now you've got the cascading parameter method that looks to see if we're authenticated. And there's another way that we can just authorize this entire page with one attribute. And that's this. Attribute authorize.
That's where that authorized root view component is important.
Right. And that's complaining because we need the namespace in imports. And here it is, just Microsoft.ASPnet Core authorization. It's a little different from this one that is for components. But there it is. Now this whole page won't be available unless we are authorized. We won't even be allowed to click the button. Not authorized. Okay.
And that message comes from the router, just in case anyone's wondering.
And then finally, what I did last week was go into the nav menu and put an authorized view around these two things. So they don't even show up as links in the nav bar unless you're authorized. So not authorized, nothing there. I can try to go by typing in the URL, not authorized. Fetch data the same way. Not sorry, you have no business here. But if I log in, now I see them. Now I can use them. Everybody's happy. Chris, thank you so much. It's been great learning from you over the last couple of years, and this blog post was just what I needed to figure out how to do all this stuff. Thanks again.
My pleasure, Carl. I'm glad I could help. It's always a joy coming on the show.
All right. Cheers. Back to you in the studio, Carl. You know, the ASPnet Core identity system is vast. There's so many ways you can customize it, and I hope I made that perfectly clear in this video. Fortunately, the documentation's pretty good when it comes to fleshing out the details, but if you're going to read up on it, I suggest the quiet car. And bring your own coffee. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a train!